go near the door all the time.
I had to be with you're my friend. Yes. Yes. Yeah, forever. So this will be nice. Worked on a big one yesterday. Lines with
So if they
can, we can move down.
we're gonna freeze it. Or both. Sit right here.
That's also recommended by the certified.
I talked to like.
Then did he die?
Yeah.
Working in the position.
Yeah, that's good. But I tried. Tried very hard.
Do you know my cousin Sharon?
Oh, Sharon.
Sharon Simmons?
Sharon, so
No, I just
I don't think so. Sharon.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
Ron did my. Oh, okay. Good. Ron passed away. Oh, she always wears black. Really?
That's true.
Black hat.
Well,
Really?
that's turned into yellow now.
Oh, really? Oh, really?
Yes.
That's your cousin? Is that your cousin?
Yeah, I only have one cousin in Kroger's world. So I
I
know
only
that.
have
That's
two.
it.
Really?
I didn't talk to her because I was a Russian.
Yellow hat or
No, yellow,
I remember his house.
and
He had a
yellow.
hat for every season.
She doesn't always.
Well,
I lived in Camp House. He had a green one. That was extraordinary. She just
Yeah.
essential things. Those paper ones don't work.
My wife's.
Not essential. Oh, you don't?
uh-oh, not more cats.
They got into
I
conversation.
try to.
Yeah.
You're actually already getting inquiries.
I said, I got a place, I got someplace.
Bye.
I left, they were talking about.
I know.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, they just got back.
We got back February 3 weeks.
I have I had my massage. Can you tell I have enough? Relax. No hairdo, no makeup.
That's what my friend said. We don't.
You know what?
Because I had to come. My massage was over at 12:30. Then I had to come and stop at my pharmacy.
I know.
Then I had to come here.
Well, they said at night I have a self-control meeting in Perrysburg. Now they're saying afternoon. I'm not going to Perrysburg if I'm gonna be stuck up there.
Salad plate.
I have everybody be like.
Yeah,
Good afternoon. Has everybody got liquid refreshment and a cookie?
Just want us to sit down. Yes.
We're going to get started. And we're happy today to have Dr. Lance Talmage as our speaker. Dr. Talmage is the Vice President of the Retirees Association and a Professor Emeritus of Obstetrics and Gynecology of the University of Toledo College of Medicine and Life Sciences. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from the University of Toledo and an MD degree from the University of Michigan. In addition to his medical practice in Toledo, he had a 32-year career in the U.S. Army Medical Department on active duty and reserve, and he was retired as a brigadier general. During Desert Shield and Desert Storm, he was on active duty at Kenner Army Hospital at Fort Lee, which is now called Fort Gregg Adams. That facility is on the edge of the Petersburg Civil War battlefield and close to many of the famous battlefields of that war. He developed an ongoing interest in the medical aspects of the battles of the Civil War. He belongs to the Society of Civil War Surgeons and has an extensive library on Civil War medical care. He has also toured almost every battlefield on the Eastern and Western theaters of the war. I'm sure we all look forward to his talk today as we learn more about the care of the sick and wounded during the Civil War. Dr. Talmage.
Thank you. I'll apologize. I have to defer to my osteoarthritic knees, and I'll probably sit through part of this, but I prefer to stand, but I'll sit a bit. 160 years ago, the Civil War ended. And most people look at the casualties and the medical care of that era as being rather brutal and primitive. And it, in fact, was. If you look at medical science at the time, it was not much different than Egyptian medicine. Medical education was extremely variable and very poor. And we'll go over all of these issues as we look through the people of the Civil War and in some of the science of the Civil War. The casualties were enormous. And since both sides were eventually, by the end of the war, they were all Americans again. We, as a country, suffered all of the casualties. And if you look at the casualties due to disease, notice that it is 2 to 1. So when we think of combat casualties, they are only 1/3 of the total deaths. Most of the deaths, or 2/3 of the deaths, were due to diseases that were known at the time, but the cause of those diseases was totally unknown. The bottom number is probably very, very conservative. The Southern record keeping was, much of it was burned in Richmond and Atlanta and other battle areas. But the number of soldiers in the Confederate Army probably is underestimated, and the number of casualties is probably very, very much underestimated. When you look at the civilian casualties as well, because of starvation and disease, there were probably well over 1 million lives lost due to the Civil War. Yeah, we'll get this right yet. There we go. Now, if you look at the casualties we have suffered as a country in other wars, the Civil War equaled all of those through Vietnam. If we add, there were not very many, but those from Afghanistan and Iraq, we have now exceeded at least the original estimate of the casualties that were suffered during the all wars by our troops. Now, here are some of the sicknesses that we endured during the Civil War. There was typhus, which is a viral scrub typhus, typhoid, which is a bacterial infection affecting the intestinal tract. And you look down at all of these, there are common diseases that now probably are curable within a day or two with antibiotics, which did not exist at that time, or at least they existed but haven't been discovered. So you can see that there were a number of different diseases. Chronic dysentery was a common disease in every camp, and we'll talk about why that as a sanitary issue came to be. One must look at the types of wounds. We'll talk about the combat injuries separate from the diseases, but people think of the saber and the bayonet as being horrible instruments, and yet they can constitute only about 4% of the wounds and deaths that were suffered by Civil War soldiers. The cannon fire was about 14%, and the rest were all 82% then were due to rifle fire, and we'll talk about why that was so as we go through the talk. Yeah, it's supposed to go. There we go. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the people who were involved in, as we talk about some of their activities, you'll get a better sense of how medicine was practiced during that era. David Drake formed 6 medical schools, mostly along the Ohio River. And the city of Cincinnati had 6 medical schools. all of which had a different philosophy. There was homeopathy, there was biophysical medicine, which was a form of manipulation. There was botanic medicine, which is mostly herbs. There was electrophysic medicine, where they used electrical current for many things. So all of these med schools produced medical students. The typical education in that day and age was 3 months of lectures, repeated a second year, and they were exactly the same lectures, but the same students. And then with enough of a fee, a certificate was given for the individual to display to show that they were a physician. Many physicians did not even go through that process. They were apprenticed. They went with an established physician, learned what that physician knew or thought he knew. And there were a few women in the medical profession at that time. We'll talk about one who was quite famous, but medical education was very minimal that era. Ephraim McDowell did the first abdominal surgery in 1809. He was educated in Scotland, and many of the physicians who could afford it did go to Scotland in that era. Closer to 1850, most of the physicians who could go overseas went to France, and they were inculcated then with the French philosophy of medicine, which was basically that if you clear the bad humors, which would usually was an emetic or a cathartic, something to clear the bowel, that the human body would heal itself. And that was a dominant philosophy of medicine at that time. Ephraim McDowell did an abdominal operation in 1809. And during the Civil War, they never did another one. The surgery was all on the peripheral parts of the body, the arms, the legs. And the only thing done in the body, in the head, were exploring for to remove the bullet or to remove bone shards, which had occurred because of the bullet, so that the individual might heal. And the mortality rate, of course, was extremely high. Laennec invented the stethoscope, a simple instrument that you could listen to the heart with. It was a wooden tube, and there was none in the Army at all during the Civil War. So technology and inventions had been made, but they were largely ignored in the medical care of that era. Another, Leeuwenhoek, invented the microscope, and you can see in the front the simple microscope here. And he was able to see small things in the microscope, didn't associate them with bacteria, and the bacterial theory of medicine or disease did not exist during the Civil War. It was thought to be humors, miasmas, the swamp gas, those type of things that caused all these diseases. And it was totally unknown that there was a bacterial infection that caused it. There were actually two microscopes in the Army inventory. One in Washington, D.C., where they examined the edge of wounds to see how they healed or how they didn't heal. And there was another that was in New York and was rarely, by reputation, ever used. Joseph Lister was alive during the Civil War and had begun his theories of aseptic surgery. However, they were in Europe and never got over here. Eventually, his care and the use of carbolic acid sprays made surgery a safe thing to do, and abdominal surgery became much more common And by the First World War, abdominal surgery was commonly carried out in order to repair bullet wounds. Louis Pasteur developed theories of bacterial infection, but again, his early work was ignored in this country. We had no concept of bacterial or viral infections for that matter. And this contributed largely to the deaths among our soldiers. Clement Finley was the Surgeon General at the beginning of the war. He was written up as a martinet, a heavy drinker, and cared little to force sanitation on the combat commanders. At the time, doctors were part of the regiments, but they did not have any authority. They had to persuade the unit commander to enforce sanitation, food discipline, food supplies, and all of the things that would keep soldiers healthy. And they had very little influence. The Sanitary Commission, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly, was his opponent. They were a volunteer organization throughout the United States, particularly in the northern states. The southern states had some relief organizations, but they provided food, dressings, clothing, and other services to our hospital and medical care. And they were instrumental in saving many, many lives. Charles Tripler, for whom the hospital in Hawaii is named, Tripler Hospital, was the surgeon for the Army of the Potomac. And his theories of sanitation were quite advanced, and he was able to influence many of the commanders so that they provided better sanitation and less casualties. William Hammond, and you see him here dressed in civilian clothes, and he has an interesting story. The Sanitary Commission finally was able to persuade Lincoln to appoint a new Surgeon General, and he appointed Hammond. Hammond had been an Army physician, but because of the fact that he couldn't influence the commanders that he worked with and his objection to some of the medications that they were using at the time, he resigned from the Army. The Sanitary Commission persuaded Lincoln to reappoint him, but he was not popular with William Stanton. Stanton was a short man, about 5'6", and Hammond was 6'2", weighed about 260 pounds. And Stanton was known for not liking anybody that he had to look up to. So he blocked his promotion. He actually served 1 year as Surgeon General, made some immense and very significant changes, but never wore the star on his shoulder. He was accused of appropriating supplies for himself. And after court-martial found him totally innocent, he was granted his rank by Congress and was able to retire as a brigadier general, which is a nice thing to do. I can attest to it. But he was very influential in the middle of the war, from 61 to 62, in changing the atmosphere of medical care. And unfortunately, he was unable to stay on and continue to do so. But there were others who came behind him, such as Jonathan Letterman, and the hospital in San Francisco, which is now closed, was named for Jonathan. And he was quite an innovator. He developed an an evacuation system to bring soldiers off the field to get to hospital care or definitive care, which is essentially still used today. And we'll go over some of the equipment that he had and how he did that. Joseph K. Barnes then was appointed after Hammond was cashiered. And Barnes was the Surgeon General for quite a number of years until 1982. I mean, 1882, not 1982. But he was of very much the same mind as Hammond and continued the sanitation and the forbidding of some of the poisonous medications that were available to physicians at the time. And he also commissioned a 6-volume set of narratives of every wound that reached the hospital. I have a second edition of that, and each book is about 6 to 8 inches thick, and there are 6 of them. So you can imagine a total number of cases, and they follow the case from wounding through recovery or death, and had they had a lot of pictures of bones and of some of the operations that were performed by the surgeons to remove legs all the way from the hip down, or from the arms, from the shoulder out. These are quite extensive operations, and yet people did survive those. But Barnes was a good Surgeon General, served well, and continued to make change, even as he was able to absorb germ theory of medicine and to improve the ability to take care of our troops. Tom McPartlin was the surgeon for the Army of the Potomac, who carried on Tripler's work. And he also made a number of discoveries, one of which was rather unique. They ran short of cotton thread, and that was what was used to tie off blood vessels when they did an amputation. And they used horsetail hair. Because horsetail hair is very stiff, they boiled it. And he noted that when they tied off the blood vessels with the boiled hair, they had far fewer infections than they did with the cotton thread. And his theory then was that boiling took some of the toxins out of the thread or tail hairs. And that was the reason for the lesser infections. And he, in fact, was right. It was the bacteria in the thread that was causing the infection. And by boiling it, even though they probably used, they put the suture on with dirty hands that they hadn't washed, they did experience far fewer infections. So observation advanced medicine throughout the 4 years of the Civil War. By the end of the Civil War, infections were much less because sanitation was better. And some surgeons even adopted hand washing between cases. And Ignaz Semmelweis in Poland had advocated that for about 20 years prior to that, when he noticed that by washing hands, maternal mortality or maternal infection decreased markedly. But that again didn't reach this country until a number of years later. John Law Olmsted is a non-physician, but very significant position as the Secretary General of the Sanitary Commission. He was able to organize the various state sanitary commissions, which were mostly women, who gathered together clothing, medical instruments, in loaded wagons, went to battlefields and contributed markedly to the ability to take care of these troops. They also had some very big advocates, and I'll show you a couple of those, for improved sanitation. And in addition, he is the architect of many inner city parks. One of the most famous is Central Park in New York City. He is the principal architect of that park, as well as another in St. Louis and a number of other large cities. So he was quite a talented young man. This is Charles Woodard. He wrote a treatise on phantom limb syndrome, which could probably be published in a modern medical journal. So there was some science. There were some very talented people, and by observation, they were able to find theory that supported the medical care. J. Marion Sims is interesting. He was a Confederate physician and was a real hero until just about 2 years ago. He was an initiator of surgery to correct what is called a vesicovaginal fistula, which means when women of the South went through a long, prolonged labor with the baby's head down in the pelvis, they would develop communication between the bladder and the vagina. He was able to develop surgery, but unfortunately, he did it on several slave women who were operated on without anesthesia. And so recently, his fame has considerably diminished. Crawford Long is another Confederate physician, and his claim to fame is that he invented anesthesia or used it for the first time in the South. There's a controversy whether a dentist named Morton at Mass General used it first, but Crawford Long supposedly used it in 1842, and Morton did his teeth extraction with anesthesia in 1844. The primary anesthetic was ether, but chloroform came along very shortly thereafter, and it's a much safer anesthetic. Ether is explosive. And if you think of using ether near a battlefield with guns being fired, you can imagine that ether might not be a good thing to have. But chloroform, which was very effective, was used. And a lot of the movies that show people biting on a bullet in order to have their amputation done are false. Chloroform was available, at least for the first number of casualties. I'm sure there were times when, because of the tremendous number of casualties that were seen at one time, that they did run out of chloroform and ether. The South did not have the capability of manufacturing chloroform, but they did have ether. The North used primarily chloroform. J.S. Billings was a young soldier, a surgeon, and his assignment by Joseph Barnes was to start a medical library. And this is the medical library was the predecessor of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which is world famous for the pathologic specimens and for its ability to analyze tissue even today as an authoritative pathologic institution. But Billings started that during the Civil War and carried it on through after the war. Oliver Wendell Holmes, you may recognize as being a Supreme Court justice. he was in fact a physician before he was a Supreme Court justice. His training was pretty much standard, same as most other physicians, which was pitifully poor. But he was quite a good jurist and served well on the Supreme Court. Many of his decisions were acclaimed as being very good. This is Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was a famous poet. I think Blades of Grass was one of his most famous poems, but he was a hospital steward. And as a hospital steward, he had a great deal of experience with the suffering and the deaths of soldiers. He then got out of the service and continued to write both poems and a couple of books, and was acclaimed as being the poet laureate of the United States. This lady is Mary Walker. She had quite an interesting story. She was a physician early in the 1800s. When the Civil War broke out, she went to the nearest battlefield, left her family, and would go out on the battlefield and pick up wounded soldiers, bring them back, and eventually at the Battle of Antietam, she was captured. She spent time in prison. She then, at the end of the war, got out of prison. She was exchanged in one of the prisoner exchanges that they had, and petitioned to be a soldier. She was denied. She became kind of a pitiful figure walking around Washington, D.C. in kind of a mixed male-female dress, but never was able to rejoin the Army as a true soldier. She was given the Medal of Honor for saving the troops on the field, and it was taken away from her in 1917 when they reviewed all the previous Medal of Honor winners, and it was said that because she was not a soldier, it was not an appropriate award. In 1977, her family had petitioned year after year after year, and the Medal of Honor was restored. And she rightfully was honored for her service to the soldiers on the field. Dorothea Dix was the head nurse for the Army, and her edict was she wanted nurses who were not too young, not too pretty, and not too anxious. She had rather different standards. However, here is one of the nurses that she did hire, Mary Safrel. She was considered the angel of Cairo. She was able to confront commanders, and her sanitation was beyond reproach. She understood where the latrines and the water points should be, and was able to probably save thousands of lives. Another woman in the Civil War was Clara Barton. You recognize her as the head of the Red Cross. She continued to function well after the war. She exhumed many, many bodies, identified them, and then notified their families. Many soldiers died on the field, were buried in shallow graves, and no one ever notified the family, and they simply didn't come home. So her continued life's work from a small garret in Washington, D.C. was to identify and notify, and she was able to petition Congress to give compensation to the widows and the families of many of those soldiers that she could identify. So she performed an excellent service for both soldiers who died as well as their families. This rather austere young lady was called Mother Bickersdyke. And Mother Bickersdyke was a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant. She was able to walk into any hospital in the Western theater of battle and tell the commander what to do. And if they questioned her, she said, what is your authority? She said, my authority comes from God and General Grant. So whatever she wanted, she got. And she was known for traveling all over the Western Front with a wagon with a huge, huge cast iron kettle and the makings of beef broth. Every place she went, she set up her kettle, fired it up, and made beef broth for the soldiers who were in those hospitals. And probably nutritionally, that helped them to recover far more than many of the other things that they got as medications.
She the one that,
Pardon?
she the one that said she ranks me.
Yes, she ranks me because she has the authority of God. So Grant deferred to her considerably. Now, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, as I said, was a great help throughout the war. They carried everything to the battlefield, and their wagons were welcomed. And in particular, the food, the warm clothing that soldiers didn't have from the supply system of the U.S. Army. Congress was extremely penurious. They didn't supply much of anything except uniforms and rifles. Even boots sometimes were hard to get. But the Sanitary Commission, and primarily run by women, and John Law Olmsted, was able to make the life of most soldiers much more comfortable and save many, many lives. They set up hospitals with volunteer physicians at many battlefields. This one is at Gettysburg, where the tremendous number of casualties overwhelmed the Army hospitals. And they were able to take care of a great number of people and save their lives with the volunteer physicians. Some of those volunteer physicians were compensated by the government, many were not. Anesthesia, as I said, was something that was available and was a godsend to the soldiers. They didn't have to bite a bullet. They actually got anesthesia. Things like chloroform were able to keep them unconscious and pain-free during what usually was a very short procedure. The surgery of the time, as I said, in the torso and the head, was not very advanced, but the ability to do a total amputation in less than 30 seconds was considered the standard for the surgeons. And it was very quickly found out that there were physicians who were surgeons and there were physicians who were physicians. Even though the Army called them all surgeons, there were those that they designated to actually do the surgery, and they became quite skilled at doing amputations. And this was the only way really to save people who had wounds of the arms and legs. The research that was done, started by Hammond and carried on by Joseph Barnes, was quite extensive, and they analyzed by observation. They didn't have pathology nor the science that we've talked about, but they were able to analyze wounds and figure out why amputations work, what kind of an amputation would work best in order to take bone fragments out so that infection was not as bad. And surgery really did advance quite significantly during the Civil War. It's interesting to know that medical science, particularly surgical science, has advanced tremendously in every war. War is a learning process. And each war has advanced our medical knowledge tremendously. The First World War was abdominal surgery. The Second World War was blood products, medical evacuation. The Korean War brought in vascular surgery as a new science. So each war has made medical practice a little bit better. Now we'll get into actual deaths. There, as you can see, people were left in the field quite a long time. Many wounded did not have, were not given water. There were no medics as such during the Civil War, and this was a cause for many to die still on the field. The way that people could be killed, as you can see here, they could be clubbed, bayoneted, the sword, and the cannon. And as I said, the sword, the saber, and the bayonet were only responsible for 4% of deaths. And the cannon, although it seems like it was a huge influence in the battles, was responsible for only about 14%. And then the gunshot wounds were the other 82%. Massive casualties in every battle. And this was due to two things that we'll go over, at least in my theory, why the casualties were so great. The Springfield rifle was invented and had been improved at the time of the Civil War. And the biggest improvement was what was called the mini bullet. And this was a bullet that had a hollow tail. It went through a rifled barrel, and compared to the musket of previous wars, where the round ball came out of the barrel at 600 feet per second, the mini ball, because of the increased pressure behind it, came out of the barrel at 1,800 feet per second. Now, if you remember a gentleman named Einstein, he said that the energy of a body is equal to the mass times the velocity squared. So if the velocity of the bullet was 3 times more than the force that it exerted when it hit was 9 times more. So in addition to having a slightly bigger bullet, which gave it, if you had twice as big a bullet, that was twice as much energy. If you had a muzzle velocity that was 3 times greater, you had 9 times the impact. So that bullet went deeper into the body. It broke bones, shattered bones, and was responsible for a lot of the casualties and the infections. It also, because of its increased power, was able to hit effectively at almost a half mile. So that as troops approached and they were using tactics from a previous war, which the Army always seems to do, they were en masse in a line. All you had to do was shoot at the line. And you could start shooting from a half mile away. And most soldiers with practice were able to reload and fire 3 times a minute. So you can imagine the tremendous amount of high power lead that came toward these lines. Now, another factor that killed 14% was the invention of grape shot. This was loading a cannon with essentially ball bearings. When they ran out of ball bearings, they would use chains, rocks, or anything else they could. But it was essentially a huge shotgun. And you can see as these cannons fire, they're plowing huge spaces through the troops that are charging. So these changes in armament made a tremendous difference in the lethality on the battlefield, and the lack of change in tactics, at least for the first half of the war, put people at great risk for being wounded. Once they started a defensive battle, which they did at Petersburg, most people were behind fences or in dirt forts, and those people who attacked them were a little less likely to come forward in a solid line. They came through staggered so that they were able to survive a little bit better. But during the initial part of the war, everybody lined up and moved forward. This is Jonathan Letterman at his tent, and he developed a system of evacuation, which, as I said, we still use today. They requisitioned wagons, and they had to fight the commanders to dedicate those wagons to the medical corps. Many of the early commanders would confiscate the wagons for ammunition and for other reasons, and left the wounded on the field. But Letterman was able to persuade the Congress and then the commanders to dedicate wagons to the evacuation of troops, and also to have dedicated medics. They were mostly the military bands. Their duty during a battle was to become the medics, load the wounded, and then they would bring them back to collecting points, which is still used today. And there they got first aid, with some of the surgeons being at the fairly far forward point of the battle. And then they were loaded up in long wagon trains and taken back to hospitals. Sometimes those hospitals were just tent flies in a cornfield. So you can imagine the potential for infection here. And the cold, the damp, all of the bad things that you can think of. And then amputations were taken at the collecting points. And here you can see a staged amputation, and you see the surgeon in uniform. And that was not uncommon. Sometimes they wore aprons, sometimes they didn't. They cleaned their hands on the apron or on their lapels between cases rather than washing their hands. So the state of medical sanitation at that point was not very good. That's a lot of limbs, and there were more and more of those. The one of McPartland was able to develop a system of putting the surgical specimens in a barrel of whiskey, and he requisitioned all the whiskey he could, and he put the limbs in the barrel of whiskey and shipped them back to J.S. Billings, who then had them examined at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C. And they were able to, through scientific observation at least, determine how they could have amputated better so that the result, the ability to move around, was better afterwards. And so that the bone fragments, which were a major source of infection, could all be found and taken out. And that was the key to a good amputation, was getting all the fragments. The collecting points were crowded, as you can see. Hundreds of people around a small building, which was considered a hospital at that point. And many waited days before they were actually treated, if they survived. There were barns that were used, and you can imagine with the animal manure and everything around a barn, how much infection would have occurred. But again, without the knowledge of germ theory, this was not known. And usually these places would be used, and when several infections occurred, because it went from soldier to soldier to soldier, they would abandon that, go to another building, a school, another barn, a large home. Many, as you tour the battlefields, you get to go through homes that still have bloodstained floors that were used as hospitals. The soldiers then usually stayed at that hospital, or what was thought to be a hospital, until they recovered sufficiently to either go back to battle if they were minor wounds, or to go home. As you can see, there's a lot of crutches there. And these people all went home to rather poor science of prostheses, although they did have artificial limbs, and they became much better as the war went on. Again, a good development of the war, but there were simply wooden legs, but most people, because of the way that the stumps were covered over with skin, they were very sensitive, and many did not use the artificial limbs because of the pain that resulted. Many were taken home by ship, steamer, up the rivers. One of the horrible accidents was called the Sultana, where one of the ships, the Sultana, ran into a mine in the Mississippi River, and all of the wounded soldiers who had survived were killed, either drowned or blown up. But in general, that and the railroads were fairly advanced, and they were able to take people home or to large cantonment hospitals in places like Washington or Philadelphia. This is a cantonment hospital, and what's unique about this is that each of these wings that you see projecting out from the center was a ward. And when there was an infection in that ward, no other patients were then admitted to it. And they went on to the next cantonment. And whenever all of the patients who were there at the time of the infection had been discharged or died, they would simply leave that building alone for about 3 months, wash it down several times, but allow the bacteria to essentially get out of it, and then they would restart to reuse it. But this was the way they used to prevent infections. Now we'll talk a little bit about pharmacy. This is a pharmacy officer mixing what is called blue mass. Blue mass is mercury, calomel. Hammond, and part of his unpopularity was that he forbade the use of calomel. And this had been a medication used by physicians for years. And it, as you may guess, mercury is poisonous. And using the philosophy that a little bit of medication does a little bit of good, and a lot of medication will do more good, doctors used very, very high doses. And patients, as you can see here, he was cutting off the heads of the dragon, which are the tremor, the fever, the hallucinations, all of the side effects of mercury poisoning. The mercury poisoning makes you mad as a hatter, hot as a stove. What were some of the other ones? But it really a terrible drug. And it was still used a little bit after Hammond was cashiered, but he was able to stop most of it. These are the calomel pills that were given to people. These are probably suppositories rather than oral pills, but it was a great cathartic. But that was one of its lesser bad problems. The other drug, which was good in ways and bad in other ways, was laudanum. Opium was a common drug. It was used for pain relief, but unfortunately, a great number of the Civil War soldiers who had been put on laudanum then became addicted to it. And the laudanum business throughout the United States was really quite extensive. These are some of the medications that the Army of the Potomac physicians carried. And you can see a lot of them are astringents, so that those were put on wounds to stop bleeding. Sulfuric acid, tannic acid, tartaric acid, all burned tissue, but it closed blood vessels. Ether was carried in their kit. Alcohol was present, but it was more probably for drinking than it was for antisepsis. Alum, which is an aluminum compound, also constricts blood vessels and stops bleeding. You can see chloroform, 35 quarts. So you can imagine 35 quarts is quite a lot, and they probably used up every last drop of it. And there was things like turpentine, which caused vomiting, and that was considered to be laudable to get rid of bad humors. Opium here, and mercury pills. So they still carried mercury pills even into the late part of the war. The Confederate medicine wagon, you can see the contrast here because of the lack of manufacturing in the South. They had very little medication. And a lot of it, as you can see, is herbal medicine. Again, herbal medicine was much more common in the South, and they relied on that. They did have morphine. They did have ether. And as I said, they were unable to manufacture
Dad,
chloroform.
what did they use rhubarb for?
Rhubarb is an astringent. Again, it's like alum. You can put it on the end of a blood vessel if it's small enough. It will close it down. Actually, the rhubarb leaf has coumadin in it, which is an anticoagulant. So if they use the rhubarb leaf instead of the stem, that didn't help because it would cause bleeding. Here's the kit for a Civil War surgeon. As you can see, the medical instruments here, the saw, probes for finding the bullets, a tourniquet. I have one of these at home. It's a small regimental hospital kit, but it's really the stainless steel quality is quite good. Now, as far as sanitation is concerned, this had a great influence on the disease that killed a great number of troops. And when you took soldiers from the city, they had mostly been immunized for smallpox. When you got the farm boys, they were totally naive to most of the diseases that the city boys had had. Measles, mumps, chickenpox, smallpox, and recruit camps were usually 3 hospitalizations per person per year because of the tremendous number of infections that were seen. And the soldiers were responsible for their own laundry and their own cooking. They cooked for themselves, and a meal in the Civil War might be hardtack, which is a hard, dry biscuit with bacon grease and coffee. They had vegetables that were desiccated vegetables, dry vegetables that could be reconstituted with water. And the nickname the soldiers gave them was desecrated vegetables. They tasted terrible. And again, the Sanitary Commission would come into these camps and they were able to bring food, fresh food, some of the vitamin C rich foods to prevent scurvy. But in every medical camp or every Army camp, there was scurvy, there was beriberi, all of the vitamin deficiency diseases. Camps were set up, and this was on the Potomac, and often because of the lack of knowledge of germ theory, they would set up the latrines upriver from the cooking camp. Therefore, everybody used the river as a latrine. All of the human waste would flow down the river where they took the water out, salmonella, all of the gastrointestinal diseases were absolutely rampant among the soldiers. It took them a long time to figure out that you put the water points upriver, the latrines downriver. This is a picture of the Andersonville camp, and as you can see, there's one stream that runs through it, and all these men. So you can imagine the deaths from disease. There were 30,000 deaths in Andersonville alone, and those who survived probably didn't come out weighing much more than 100 pounds. Some of the commanders of the camps were rather cruel, particularly in Andersonville. We had a prisoner of war camp for the Confederate soldiers on Johnson's Island. That was fairly well run. But when they found out about Andersonville, our commanders took the blankets away from the Civil War soldiers. So there was a lot of revenge, and therefore mortality was rather high, even in the Union camps. What about the doctors in the Civil War? Total surgeons, 12,343. And that doesn't count the civilian surgeons who volunteered at a number of the battles. But there were some that were killed in battle. Some died of wounds. There were 4 that died in Confederate prisons. And again, as you can see, died of disease is almost 10 times as many as died of wounds. So again, disease was the killer of the Civil War. There were also a number of physicians who were not physicians. This gentleman was a regimental commander for the infantry, even though he was a doctor. And this formidable looking guy is a cavalry commander who also came in as a doctor but did not function as a doctor. I've got, it's 3 o'clock. We're supposed to go to 3:30. I've got what's called lagniappe. That's Cajun for a little extra. So since I've got time. Now, this is a representation of the debauchery and drinking, which killed a lot of soldiers. And in particular, it's interesting that this gentleman's name is Hooker. And it is not the origin of the title Hooker. That came way, way before him. But his philosophy of women and drinking was rather permissive. And the amount of alcohol poisoning and of venereal disease rose dramatically with his battle. I mean, with his command. And Lincoln eventually figured that out and took him out of command. What he replaced him with was probably not a whole lot better, but this was called Hooker's Brigade, which was one corner of Washington, D.C., which was populated by nothing but bars and bordellos. So the morality of our soldiers was probably not any better than it is today. Venereal disease rates were quite high. And of course, the cure for it was thought to be arsenic or mercury. And as we all know, arsenic and mercury are both poisons.
Took care of it.
Until penicillin came on board, that was the best they had. And you can see places like Columbus Barracks in Ohio had an extremely high rate. If they were in camp and kept in camp, that kept down the rate of venereal disease. But if they were in places like Columbus or New Mexico, and out in the Pacific, syphilis was really quite a killer then. Another thing that made the battlefield more dangerous were the repeating arms. We went from the Springfield rifle to the Sharps and a number of other rifles that were able to fire as fast as you could pump the handle. And therefore, units like this Michigan Cavalry unit were supplied Sharps rifles by their home organizations. They bought them, provided them. The United States Congress did not. So if a unit had automatic weapons, they were usually, or semi-automatic weapons, they were usually supplied by their own state. 114th Ohio had what were called Colt repeating rifles. And the Alabama brigade, which was coming against them, said they thought they were fighting against a brigade, and it was actually just a company. So they were able to fire 6 shots as fast as they could pull the trigger. And then they had people in the back reloading them. It looked for all the world like a Colt pistol, but it had a long barrel. It also had a bad habit of backfiring, so that one of the chambers with a bullet in it would fire backwards instead of forwards, which obviously was not very good. So it was not a popular rifle. There was the pipe organ. This was a whole row of rifle barrels, each of which was loaded, and they could fire them off right down the line. So it was somewhat close to a machine gun. And this was a Gatling gun, which is the forerunner of the machine gun of the Second World War. It was invented at the beginning of the war. It was demonstrated to Lincoln, and Congress did not authorize it to be used or made until the very end of the war, and it was used at Sailor's Creek and near Appomattox, and it was an absolute horrible weapon. It could kill as fast as you could crank the crank. And then it was used in the Indian Wars to some extent as well. So weapons did change during the war, and they became more lethal. And they presaged those weapons that were used in the First World War 50 years later. This is what grape shot looks like. That is a tube full of ball bearings, essentially ball bearings. So it was like firing 30 rifles at one time. Their velocity was not as great, so they didn't, the balls didn't penetrate as much, but they had enough power in them to do some major damage. And because you could throw out so many at one time, the casualties were increased. And that is the conclusion of Civil War medicine. I'll be glad to take questions. Yes.
When you talk about the mortality rate of the doctors in the war, or when they went out on the battlefield, were they protected like the Geneva Convention? Like, did they have hats on that, or were they live game to be shot at? Or was it rules of engagement to not shoot at them?
Well, they usually didn't go anywhere near the battle.
They waited until the end?
Number one. And the Geneva Convention didn't exist by then. That was considerable number of years later. It was after, forget, the Geneva Convention was after the First World War.
They don't get all that anymore.
But they were not identified necessarily, except by a green sash. The infantry used blue, the engineers used red, and the medical sash was green. So they could be identified, but generally they weren't close. Sharpshooters occasionally would get some. Those are the ones that were killed. Yes.
One treatise that I read, the final conclusion was that the effects of treatment and surgery, the benefits thereof did not exceed the risks and iatrogenic effects of the procedures until after the Civil War.
Right.
In other words, your chances were better that you would, if you didn't get surgery or treatment before the Civil War.
Well, that was true of any body surgery, torso. But as far as the limbs were concerned, if they did not amputate, then those wounds almost always developed either staph infections or true gangrene, clostridial infections. So amputation was the only way to take care of that. They did not have antibiotics. But to your point, Garfield died of his wound, which he probably would not have had they just left it alone. The bullet went through the fat tissue, didn't go in the abdomen, but they kept probing to try to get the bullet out. And that probing introduced bacteria, and he died of the infection rather than of the bullet wound. So even up to that point, the understanding of germ theory was very, very poor. Yes.
So you mentioned that Europe had much higher understandings of some of these germs theories and stuff. Why were we so reluctant to adopt that information?
Communication.
Just to go.
These were early works of Pasteur and Lister. It wasn't that they were withholding the information. It's just that they were not accepted there either. The run-of-the-mill doctor thought they were quacks. So until they were able to prove their theories, and then the communication between Europe and the United States was slow. It took how many weeks to cross the ocean. So we just didn't get the information. The medical school system really began about 1980. The University of Michigan was founded then. Harvard, Yale. And during the Civil War, the Army found that so many doctors were so poor in their knowledge and abilities that they initiated an exam. It was a primitive exam, but it disqualified a number of bad physicians and made them better. And then licensure began to be taken care of by the states, so that by 1912, every physician took a graduate exam and was licensed if they passed that exam. So it took a number of years before the standards of education and medical care were.
I hear that, so many people will say, well, why, if they were shot in the arm or leg, why didn't they just set the bones? But the mini ball just shattered.
The mini ball, because of the energy, usually broke the bone into multiple fragments. And each one of those fragments, bone is not a live tissue. It has blood vessels that go into it, but it's calcium, fluoride, all those minerals, and it served as a foreign body, and it accumulated bacteria. The other thing that happens is that when a bullet enters the body, it creates a waveform that sucks in everything from outside. So if you're laying in a mud puddle with a dirty uniform on, your wound winds up with muddy water, wool, and everything, pieces of wood and everything else. So it sucks in everything outside, and then the bacteria are created.
So many people say, why didn't they set the leg? Isn't anything left to set?
If you set it, the infection would kill them. Yes.
Did they use patent medicines?
Well, as I said, particularly the Southern physicians used a lot of herbals. That was their culture, and they did a lot of herbal medicine. Patent medicines, I don't think so. They stuck pretty much to what was considered medical science at the time. I'm sure there were snake oil salesmen somewhere in the years. You have a question?
I really appreciate your talk, and I like how you brought up the history of military. But I want to touch on the current event, like what's going on right now with the military, if I don't mind. And I have a quick question. What I think is the most prolific change that has happened with the military just recently has been the addition of women. And that's never been like that in the ranks. So I think that is going to be very different for the future conflicts. So, because in the past, there was like a rung that women would help out in, and then the rest of the field was always just men. Now, it's mixed.
Right. Oh, I quite agree. You know, when I went in, there were a couple changes. One, there were no osteopathic physicians. Two, the women were mostly in the supply chain or nurses. Now it's changed immensely. So I guess many units are 20 to 30% female. Even combat units are becoming more and more feminized.
Yeah, they're
So
planned.
it makes a difference. No question about it. Yes.
Thanks for sharing. A picture is worth 1,000 words, what you showed us. Fast forward to today, drones, IEDs, the ravages of war. What's your thoughts? As a physician and as a military?
Well, war is terrible. No question about it. But the mortality rate in the Civil War was 6 people out of 7 who reached medical care survived. So 1 out of 7 died. Now the survival rate is greater than is less than 1%. I mean, greater than 99%. So if you get through that magic hour, the golden hour, and reach medical care, you have a 99% plus rate of survival. Now, you may maybe minus a limb, minus an organ, but survivability is tremendously higher now, which means that we can save a lot of young people, but unfortunately, you save those who are wounded. And our lethality of weaponry is so much higher. We have the Springfield rifle was a real game changer, but the game has gotten much, much more lethal. Yes.
I have one comment on the Sultana. The hitting a mine is a possibility, but they have since found other things. The Sultana was extremely overloaded because the quartermaster in the town and the captain of the ship each got money for every soldier that was put on that ship. They were paroled prisoners from Cahaba, and I'm thinking Andersonville, but I'm not 100% sure. The really sick or wounded people were sent on other steamships or by train. These were still walking people. But if you see a picture of the Sultana, it is packed with paroled prisoners.
It may have been the boiler that blew up.
Well, I didn't take care of his boat. He was a jockey. He wanted to be the first person anywhere. He wanted to be the first person down the Mississippi. He draped it in black crepe for Lincoln dying. He wanted to be the captain who was announcing to everybody that Lincoln was dead. He bought all the newspapers, like in the big towns, so he could sell them in the little towns. And the quartermaster in Memphis, not Memphis, but where they were docked, he had been drummed out. He was a friend of Lincoln. Lincoln put him back in the military. And when the boilers blew, it was nighttime. People were sleeping. This happened, the Mississippi was in flood. It happened in April, just a few miles north of Memphis. So the current was something else, and many people perished.
Oh yeah, it was a terrible disaster.
Well, my great-grandfather perished on the Sultana.
That's interesting.
Yeah, guarding paroled prisoners north. One of the 6 guards. I mean, like you can't get a break. The war was over. You know.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, but there's much more on the steamship blowing up, and there's a museum in Marion, Arkansas, which will be opening up this year.
I went through an hour and 20 minutes worth of stuff, and each one of those, like the Sultana, could be one lecture by itself.
Oh.
Each battle, like Antietam,
oh yeah,
or Gettysburg, could take up an hour and a half if you really want to talk about it.
Or a whole trip.
Fortunately, when I was at Petersburg, I'd go to church on Sunday morning and then run through the battlefield. I can't do that anymore, unfortunately. But then my wife would come and visit me, and we'd go out and go to one of the battlefields and have a picnic or do something like that. So she got a real dose of the Civil War. I think she still thinks I was at Gettysburg. Yes.
What about what's now considered like PTSD? Any psychological effects on soldiers?
It was totally unrecognized, but yes. I mean, anybody who's been in a battle has a degree of PTSD. And even in the First World War, it was called shell shock. Yeah. And in the Second World War, they called it battle fatigue. And the name PTSD, I think, was laid into Vietnam. But the recognition that if you're shooting at somebody, somebody's shooting at you, is traumatic. And particularly those who are wounded and have to deal with the consequences of that wound. PTSD is extremely common. It's a matter of, I don't know, it's probably not genetics, but it's how you handle it that makes it. Yes.
One of the things you had on one of the first slides was suicide. Was that suicide once a soldier went home or once he was still in the battlefield area?
Or while they were in camp.
Okay.
So that's the extreme, I guess, of PTSD.
Oh, yeah.
And the stress, and they killed themselves.
I never had thought about suicide during the Civil War. When I saw that, I thought, whoa.
Yeah.
So it happened, yes.
And when you talked about disease being one of the primary causes of fatalities, was that primarily due to just unsanitary conditions on both sides, or was a lot of that connected with the field hospitals and that sort of thing and passed around there?
Well, it was in the camps, so it was sanitation. As I said, they
In the camps
didn't realize
themselves.
that bacteria floated down the river.
Makes sense.
But then there was no treatment either. I mean, if you had salmonella typhi right now, an antibiotic is going to clear you up within a day. But in those days, they didn't have the antibiotic. So once you got it, you either were able to survive it because you were strong enough, you got enough nutrition. They didn't use IVs. They didn't give IV fluids, which you could take a cholera epidemic and shut that off in a day with IV fluids. They didn't do that.
No.
Thank you.
Oh, things good.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. I thought I wanted.
Liver better.
Oh, good. I got it smelling.
We'll have a, actually we have the.
Your help, okay?
How was it?
Oh, I thought it was, well, the book was.
Said you felt okay the first couple of weeks, didn't you? And I said, yes. Why am I feeling this way now? She said, major surgery. Take it easy.
Well,
You know, I said,
concerns the history
I
of
sit there and read a book
pain,
a day. I don't have the
relationships.
endurance to do.
Religion.
So that's what I was concerned about. I
In
thought,
Medina,
"Man,
yeah,
now
well,
I'm
it's
getting
largely southern Spain.
yesterday, everything was perfect. I don't have any of that. She said,
And others.
I love
It was kind of a complicated.
yeah, but I didn't even
Rush. It's not perfect.
it's being a problem.
It's supposed to, but doesn't mean they follow it. Right. I knew they didn't have
All the meetings.
but I didn't know.